It was a warm summer afternoon in the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Maplewood. The kind of day when kids rode their bikes, dogs barked playfully, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves across manicured lawns. But for 16-year-old Jamal, what started as an ordinary trip to the park was about to become an experience he'd never forget. Jamal was a bright, polite, and ambitious teenager. He was known around the neighborhood for being respectful and always willing to lend a helping hand. That day, he had decided to take a short walk to the park to work on his basketball skills, carrying nothing but his well-worn basketball under his arm and a hopeful smile on his face. He dreamed of making his high school team and was determined to perfect his jump shot. As Jamal approached the park, a woman sitting on her porch noticed him. Her name was Karen, a name that, ironically, had become shorthand for those quick to assume the worst about others, especially people who didn't look like them. Karen was in her mid-40s, wearing a pastel cardigan and clutching a glass of iced tea. She prided herself on being the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, always watching out for suspicious activity. And to her, Jamal, minding his own business, suddenly fit that description. Karen's gaze narrowed as she watched Jamal dribble his basketball down the street. Something about him, his confidence, his presence, seemed to unsettle her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong, so without hesitation she reached for her phone, dialing the police. "I'd like to report a suspicious individual," she said, her voice laced with concern. "There's a young man walking through the neighborhood, and I don't think he lives around here." The dispatcher, accustomed to these types of calls, asked for more details. "Is he doing anything illegal?" "Well, no," Karen admitted, "but he's acting suspicious." Meanwhile, Jamal had reached the park, completely unaware of what was unfolding just a few blocks away. He began practicing his shots, focused on the rhythm of the game and the feel of the ball leaving his fingertips. To him, the world felt simple in these moments, like nothing else mattered but the hoop and the dream he was chasing. Minutes later, the tranquility of the park was shattered by the sound of sirens. 2 patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing. Jamal froze, confused, as officers stepped out of their vehicles and walked toward him. His heart pounded in his chest as they approached, their expressions stern. "We got a call about a suspicious individual," one of the officers said. Jamal blinked, his mind racing. He looked down at his basketball, then back at the officers. "I was just practicing," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with confusion. Karen had followed the commotion, standing at a distance with her arms crossed as if awaiting validation for her actions. "That's him," she said, pointing at Jamal. "I knew something wasn't right." The officers asked Jamal for identification, and though he was shaken, he complied. He reached for his phone to call his mom, wanting her there to help explain and defuse the situation. As the officers checked his ID, Jamal's mom, Nicole, arrived on the scene. She pulled up in a sleek black SUV, stepping out with an air of authority that immediately changed the atmosphere. Nicole was no ordinary mom. She was confident, sharp, and commanding, a woman who had spent years climbing the ranks in law enforcement. But what Karen and the officers didn't know yet was that Nicole was the FBI's regional chief, and she wasn't about to let anyone mistreat her son. As Nicole approached, her eyes locked onto Karen and then the officers. Her calm demeanor masked a storm brewing inside her. The tension in the air was palpable, and even Karen seemed to sense that something was about to change. "Is there a problem here?" Nicole asked, her tone steady but firm. Her question hung in the air, and in that moment, everything froze. Karen's smug expression began to falter. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Jamal felt a flicker of hope. And that's where this story truly begins. Nicole's words hung in the air like a sharp warning. She stood tall, her presence radiating an undeniable authority that seemed to catch everyone off guard. The officers hesitated for a moment, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Karen, however, refused to back down. She straightened her shoulders, glancing at Nicole with the same judgmental look she had given Jamal moments earlier. "Are you his mother?" Karen asked, her tone laced with irritation. I called the police because he was acting suspicious. He doesn't belong here. Nicole turned her attention to Karen, her expression calm but her eyes razor-sharp. My son doesn't belong here? She repeated, her voice even but firm. He was playing basketball in a public park. What exactly was so suspicious about that? Karen's face flushed slightly, but she pressed on. Look, I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. You can never be too careful these days. Nicole didn't respond immediately. She glanced at Jamal, who was standing quietly nearby, gripping his basketball as if it was the only thing grounding him. Her son had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, surrounded by flashing lights and judgmental stares, his innocence being questioned simply because of who he was. One of the officers cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. Ma'am, he said to Nicole, we're just following up on a call. We have to respond to reports of suspicious activity. Nicole's eyes shifted to the officer, her calm composure unwavering. And what activity exactly did you find suspicious? She asked. Did my son break a law? Did he threaten anyone? Or is this entire situation based on someone's assumptions and prejudices? The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. It was clear they were starting to realize they were in over their heads. Nicole's presence was not that of an ordinary concerned parent. There was something about her tone, her confidence, that hinted at her deep understanding of how the system worked. Karen, still standing off to the side, seemed frustrated that the situation wasn't going the way she had anticipated. I'm not prejudiced, she snapped defensively. I just thought, well, he looked out of place. This is a quiet neighborhood. Nicole turned back to Karen, her expression neutral but her words piercing. Out of place, she repeated, as if testing the weight of the phrase. A teenager playing basketball in a park looks out of place to you? Karen opened her mouth to respond but faltered, unable to come up with an answer that wouldn't betray her bias. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Nicole took a step closer to Karen, her voice calm but filled with a quiet power that demanded attention. You didn't call the police because my son did something wrong. You called them because of how he looks. And whether you realize it or not, you've put him in danger. Karen looked as if she wanted to argue, but Nicole wasn't finished. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up knowing that people will judge you, fear you, or assume the worst about you just because of your skin color? My son knows. I've spent his entire life trying to protect him from people who see him as a threat, even when he's just trying to live his life. And today, he had to face that fear because of you. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. The officers, meanwhile, seemed unsure of how to proceed. They glanced at each other, then at Nicole, who was clearly commanding the situation. Jamal, still standing nearby, watched his mother with a mix of awe and relief. She always knew how to handle situations like this. She had taught him to stay calm, to be respectful, and to let her step in when things got out of hand. But even with her strength and authority, he couldn't help but feel the sting of the moment, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. Nicole turned to the officers, her expression softening slightly but her tone still firm. Officers, I understand that you have a job to do, but this situation never should have escalated to this point. My son isn't a suspect and he hasn't done anything wrong. I'd like you to explain to me why this response was necessary. The officers shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable, under her scrutiny. One of them, the younger of the two, spoke up. Ma'am, we were just responding to a call. We didn't mean to cause any trouble. Nicole nodded slowly, her gaze steady. Responding to a call is one thing, but when you arrived, you saw a teenage boy playing basketball. Did that look like suspicious activity to you? The officer hesitated, then shook his head. No, ma'am. Then, why are we still here? Nicole asked, her voice calm but pointed. The officer had no response, and the weight of her words seemed to hang heavily in the air. Karen, sensing that the situation was slipping out of her control, tried to interject. I was just trying to be cautious, she said, her tone defensive. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Nicole turned to her, her expression unreadable. Caution is one thing, she said quietly, but your assumptions have consequences. Today your actions could have hurt my son. Think about that the next time you feel the need to pick up the phone. Karen looked down, her face red with embarrassment. For the first time, she seemed to understand the gravity of what she had done, though she said nothing more. Nicole took a deep breath, turning back to Jamal. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with both love and determination. Let's go, she said softly. Jamal nodded, and together they began walking toward their car. As they reached the SUV, Nicole opened the door for Jamal before turning back to the officers. I'd appreciate it if you took this as an opportunity to reflect, she said, her tone even. We all have a responsibility to do better. With that, she got into the car and started the engine. As they drove away, Jamal looked out the window, watching the park fade into the distance. His mother's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. Back at the park, Karen stood silently on the sidewalk, her glass of iced tea now forgotten. The officers returned to their patrol cars, their expressions thoughtful. The neighborhood was quiet once again, but the echoes of the encounter lingered, leaving everyone with something to think about. Nicole glanced at Jamal in the rearview mirror, her heart aching for her son but filled with pride at the way he had handled himself. She knew this wouldn't be the last time they faced challenges like this, but she also knew they would face them together. And that, she thought, was what mattered most. As Nicole and Jamal drove away from the park, an uneasy silence filled the car. Jamal stared out of the window, his mind replaying the events over and over. No matter how much he tried to shake it off, the image of the officers approaching him and Karen pointing him out lingered. It wasn't the first time he'd felt judged for his skin color, but this time was different. This time it felt heavier, more personal. Nicole glanced at him through the rearview mirror. You okay? She asked, her voice soft but probing. Jamal hesitated. He wanted to say he was fine, that it didn't bother him, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. I don't get it, Mom, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why does this keep happening? I wasn't doing anything wrong. Nicole's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she fought to keep her own emotions in check. It's not about what you did, Jamal, she said gently. It's about what they see, and that's something I've tried to prepare you for, but no matter how much we talk about it, it doesn't make it fair or right. Jamal turned to face her. But you stood up for me. You always do. How do you do it? How do you stay so calm when people are like that? Nicole let out a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. It's not easy, she admitted. Every time it happens, it feels like a battle. But I've learned that losing my temper doesn't solve anything. If I lose control, I give them a reason to see me the way they already assume I am. So I stay calm, stay firm, and I remind them who I am, who we are. Jamal nodded, though he didn't feel entirely reassured. He appreciated his mom's strength, but he couldn't help feeling like it shouldn't have to be this way. Does it ever get better? He asked quietly. Nicole paused for a moment. It can, she said, but only if people like us keep pushing for change. That's why I do what I do. That's why I became an FBI agent, to fight for fairness and justice, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. Jamal leaned back in his seat, her words sinking in. He had always admired his mom's career, but today it took on a new meaning. She wasn't just doing a job. She was fighting a fight that so many people didn't even realize needed to be fought. Meanwhile, back at the park, Karen sat on her porch, replaying the confrontation in her mind. At first, she tried to justify her actions to herself. She had only been trying to protect the neighborhood, right? But the longer she sat there, the more uncomfortable she felt. Nicole's words kept echoing in her mind. Your assumptions have consequences. Karen looked down at her phone, scrolling through her social media feed aimlessly. She stumbled upon a local news article about a community forum on racial bias being held later that week. Normally, she would have dismissed something like that without a second thought. But now something made her pause. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had something to learn. The officers who had responded to Karen's call weren't immune to reflection either. Officer Ramirez, the younger of the two, sat in the precinct's break room later that evening, staring at his coffee cup. He couldn't shake the look on Nicole's face when she had questioned him. She had been calm, but her words had cut deep. He realized he hadn't truly thought about the impact of responding to calls like Karen's before. His partner, Officer Hayes, walked in and sat across from him. "You okay?" Hayes asked, noticing Ramirez's distant expression. "Yeah," Ramirez said, though his tone was unconvincing. "Just thinking about what happened earlier, I don't know. It didn't feel right." Hayes nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get what you mean. It's tough. We're trained to respond to every call, but sometimes it feels like we're caught in the middle of something bigger than us." Ramirez looked up. "Do you think we handled it the right way?" Hayes hesitated. "I don't know. We didn't escalate it, but maybe we could have de-escalated it sooner. I've been doing this job for a long time, and one thing I've learned is that not every call is what it seems. Maybe we need to start asking more questions, looking deeper before we act." Ramirez nodded, grateful for his partner's honesty. He made a mental note to approach future calls with more thoughtfulness. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step in the right direction. That night, Nicole sat in her home office, scrolling through a draft of an internal memo she had been working on for weeks. It was a proposal to implement community-based training for officers on racial bias and de-escalation tactics. The events of the day had only strengthened her resolve to push it forward. Jamal knocked on the doorframe, holding his basketball. "Mom?" Nicole looked up and smiled. "Hey, sweetheart. What's up?" "I was thinking," he said, stepping into the room. "Do you think we could talk to the kids at my school about what happened today? Like maybe we could help them understand. I don't know how to handle things like this." Nicole's heart swelled with pride. "That's a great idea," she said. "You're already braver than most adults." "I know," Jamal smiled faintly. "I just don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt today." Nicole stood and hugged him tightly. "Neither do I," she said. "And together, we'll do what we can to make sure they don't." The story was far from over, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But in that moment, both Nicole and Jamal felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible, one conversation at a time. Unbeknownst to them, Karen was also preparing to attend that community forum. She wasn't sure what to expect, and she wasn't even sure she belonged there, but something inside her told her it was time to listen. The tension remained, the questions still unanswered, but the seeds of change had been planted. Now, it was only a matter of whether they would grow. The days that followed felt like a strange mixture of unease and determination. Jamal went back to school trying to focus on his classes and his basketball practice, but the memory of what had happened in the park lingered. He noticed the look some of his classmates gave him, sympathetic from some, curious from others. A few even approached him asking about the incident. "Is it true?" one of them asked during lunch. "Did the cops really show up because some lady thought you looked suspicious?" Jamal nodded, the weight of their stares making him feel exposed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's what happened." One of his friends, Marcus, shook his head angrily. "Man, that's so messed up, they didn't even have a reason." Jamal shrugged. "That's just how it is sometimes." But even as he said it, he felt a flicker of anger. Why was it like this? Why did people like Karen get to make baseless accusations? And why did the system always seem to back them up? At home, Nicole was dealing with her own frustrations. She had submitted her memo about community-based training to her superiors, but the response she received was lukewarm at best. Some of her colleagues supported her ideas, but others dismissed them as unnecessary. "Nicole, we have protocols in place already," one of them had said during a meeting. The officers followed procedure. "What more do you want?" I want the procedures to change, Nicole had replied, her tone firm. Because if we keep doing things the same way, we'll keep getting the same results. She was met with silence, and though she didn't back down, she knew she had an uphill battle ahead of her. Meanwhile, Karen found herself feeling more out of place than ever. She had decided to attend the community forum on racial bias, but walking into the packed community center that evening felt like stepping into another world. Most of the attendees were people of color, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was looking at her, judging her. She took a seat in the back, clutching her purse tightly as the event began. The first speaker was a local activist, a young woman named Tasha, who shared her own experiences with racial profiling. As Tasha spoke, Karen felt a knot forming in her stomach. It's not always about what someone does, Tasha said. It's about what people assume about them. And those assumptions can be dangerous. They can ruin lives, they can end lives. Karen's hands trembled as she realized just how close she had come to being the reason something went terribly wrong. She thought back to Nicole's words. Your assumptions have consequences. As the forum continued, Karen's discomfort grew, but so did her understanding. She began to see the world from a perspective she had never considered before, and it was unsettling. But it was also necessary. The tension in the story reached its peak a few days later, when Nicole received a phone call from the school principal. Jamal had been asked to share his experience with his classmates during a school assembly, and while Nicole was proud of her son, she also knew it would be an emotional moment for both of them. Are you sure you're ready for this? She asked Jamal the night before. Jamal hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he said. I think it's important. If I don't say something, who will? The next day, the auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and even a few parents who had heard about the assembly and wanted to attend. Nicole sat in the front row, her heart pounding as she watched Jamal step onto the stage. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced, but then he thought about everything his mom had taught him. He thought about the kids who might never have the courage to speak up, and he began. I didn't think this would happen to me, he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. I mean, I've heard about it. I've seen it on the news. But when it's you, it feels different. It feels like the whole world is looking at you and deciding who you are before you even get a chance to show them. The room was silent, every pair of eyes locked on Jamal as he continued. I was just playing basketball, he said. That's all. But someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong. They decided I was a threat, and because of that, the police were called. He paused, taking a deep breath before looking directly at the crowd. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because it happens, and it's not just me. It's happening to people all over, and it's not fair. Nicole felt a tear slide down her cheek as she watched her son speak with such honesty and courage. She had always known he was special, but seeing him stand up for what was right filled her with a pride she couldn't put into words. As Jamal finished, the audience erupted into applause. Some of his classmates stood clapping and cheering for him, and for the first time since the incident, Jamal felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. But the story wasn't over yet. In the back of the auditorium, someone else had been listening, closely. Karen had decided to attend the assembly after hearing about it from a neighbor. She had wanted to apologize to Nicole and Jamal, but she hadn't found the courage. Now, listening to Jamal's story, she realized just how much her actions had affected him. Karen stood there frozen in place as the applause died down and the crowd began to disperse. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of facing Nicole and Jamal filled her with dread. Still, she couldn't walk away, not this time. Nicole and Jamal had started a ripple effect, and the tension in the air hinted that something big was about to happen. The questions still lingered. Would Karen find the courage to take responsibility for her actions? Would the community rally together to create real change? And most importantly, would this moment lead to understanding, or would it fade away, like so many others before it? The climax was near and everyone could feel it. As the crowd began to disperse, Karen lingered near the back of the auditorium, her heart pounding. She knew she needed to speak to Nicole and Jamal, but the thought of walking up to them, admitting her mistake, and asking for forgiveness felt insurmountable. What if they didn't want to hear her out? What if her apology wasn't enough? For the first time in a long while, Karen felt small, vulnerable, and unsure of herself. Nicole was speaking to a teacher near the stage when she noticed Karen standing awkwardly in the corner of her vision. At first, Nicole wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but when Karen made eye contact, Nicole's expression shifted. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and her posture straightened, signaling that she had noticed the woman who had turned her family's quiet day at the park into a nightmare. Karen hesitated, her body frozen in place as Nicole stared at her. Jamal hadn't noticed yet. He was busy talking to a group of classmates who had come up to commend him for his speech. Nicole's mind raced. What was Karen doing here? Was she here to justify her actions, to apologize, or something else entirely? Finally, Karen took a hesitant step forward, clutching her purse tightly. Her steps were slow, each one measured, as if she were walking toward her own trial. When she reached Nicole, she stopped, leaving a few feet between them. "Hi," Karen said softly, her voice barely audible over the buzz of conversation in the room. Nicole crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Karen," she said evenly, acknowledging her presence but nothing more. Karen swallowed, hard, glancing at Jamal before looking back at Nicole. I wanted to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If that's okay." Nicole didn't respond immediately. She studied Karen, searching for sincerity in her expression. Karen looked uncomfortable, almost ashamed, and Nicole could see the weight of something heavy in her demeanor. After a long pause, Nicole gave a small nod. "All right," Nicole said, her tone calm but guarded. "What do you want to say?" Karen glanced around, clearly nervous about speaking in such a public space. Can we step outside?" "I'd rather not do this here," she said, her voice still quiet. Nicole hesitated, then gestured toward the exit. "Lead the way." Outside, the cool breeze provided a sharp contrast to the tension between the two women. They stood on the steps of the school, away from the lingering crowd inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence amplifying the gravity of the moment. "I was wrong," Karen finally said, her voice breaking slightly. What I said that day, it was wrong, and I'm so sorry." "And I'm so—" Nicole's expression remained steady, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she processed Karen's words. "Why now?" she asked. "What made you decide to say this today?" Karen took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting nervously. "Because I've been thinking about it, about everything, about what you said, about what your son said in there. I've been thinking about how I acted and why I acted that way, and I don't like what I see." Nicole tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving Karen's face. "And what is it that you see?" Karen hesitated, her face flushing with shame. "I see someone who made assumptions, someone who acted out of fear, out of ignorance. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I was wrong." Nicole remained silent, letting Karen's words hang in the air. She could see the genuine remorse in Karen's eyes, but she wasn't ready to let her off the hook so easily. "You put my son in danger," Nicole said, her voice firm but not angry. "Do you understand that? Calling the police on a black teenager for playing basketball could have ended very differently. You didn't just inconvenience us, Karen. You put Jamal's life at risk." Karen's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been thinking about that too. I've been thinking about what could have happened if things had gone differently, and it terrifies me. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try. I need to try." Nicole sighed, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to accept Karen's apology, to believe that people could change, but another part of her was still angry, still hurt. "Trying isn't enough," Nicole said, finally. "It's a start, but it's not enough. If you really want to make this right, you need to do more than apologize. You need to educate yourself. You need to speak out when you see injustice. You need to use your privilege to make a difference. Karen nodded quickly, as if grasping onto Nicole's words like a lifeline. I will, she said. I promise. I've already started. I went to that community forum the other night and I'm trying to learn. I know it's not enough, but I'm trying. Nicole studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Good, she said. Keep trying. Before either of them could say anything else, the sound of raised voices drew their attention. Nicole turned toward the parking lot, her instincts kicking in immediately. Jamal was standing near the edge of the lot facing a group of older boys who looked angry. Nicole's heart raced as she started walking toward them, Karen following close behind. The scene unfolding before them was tense, the air crackling with hostility. What's going on here? Nicole asked, her voice firm as she approached. One of the older boys turned to her, his expression defiant. This is none of your business, lady, he said, his tone sharp. Nicole stepped closer, her presence commanding. When my son is involved, it is my business, she said. Jamal looked at his mom, relief flashing in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. The older boys exchanged glances, clearly debating their next move. The tension was thick, the situation teetering on the edge of escalation. Nicole's instincts told her there was more to this than met the eye. Something bigger was happening, here, and it wasn't just about Jamal. Whatever it was about to come to a head.